The American Revolutionary War was at first far from revolutionary. That's because most colonists and leaders were not looking for independence, but rather just to have their rights as Englishmen restored. It took over 1 year of bloody conflict to declare independence. But what finally led to this revolutionary change? Well, that's the treasure we're out to discover. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. Before we get going, I just want to remind teachers and homeschool parents that there are lesson plans and resources that go with this episode on my website, historyforhumans.com. And now, our exploration question for today's lesson is, what finally convinced leaders in the Continental Congress to declare independence? So consider what events helped lead to this revolutionary change. And now shovels out because we got some history to dig. The American Revolutionary War began over issues of taxes, tea, and tyranny. After years of protesting for the restoration of their rights to King George and Parliament, the two forces, the rebels and the Empire, finally came to blows at Lexington and Concord. After the first battle, the Second Continental Congress met in May of 1775 in Philadelphia. The delegates from all 13 colonies had to organize the war effort, but they focused on trying to get the king to redress their grievances and the violations of their rights, and not on becoming an independent nation. Congress adopted the Olive Branch Petition. This professed their loyalty to the crown and pleaded with the king to end the hostilities and to restore their rights. But King George III rejected this peace offering and proclaimed the colonies in open rebellion, making their actions treasonous. So you might be asking yourself, why wasn't everyone on board with independence? First of all, many colonists still identified themselves as Englishmen, and each colony had closer ties with Britain than with each other. Also, in early 1776, there was little hope of winning a war against the most powerful empire in the world. Britain had a professional army with nearly unlimited resources against untrained and undisciplined militiamen. And other colonists were actually more worried about what would happen if they won the war. What? Yeah, because without the king and parliament, who would rule over them and protect them from other European nations? What would ensure their new government would actually work and not collapse into chaos? Enter Thomas Paine, a radical English immigrant and a passionate supporter of American independence. In January of 1776, he wrote the most influential pamphlet in American history, Common Sense. In plain language, he argued why the colonies would be better off if they weren't ruled over by the royal brute, King George. Common Sense made an impassioned plea to the American cause of liberty and Republican government. He said, "We have every opportunity to form the noblest and purest constitution on the face of the earth. We have it in our power to begin the world again." Common Sense went 18th century viral, selling around 150,000 copies, and it moved many neutral Americans to embrace independence at whatever cost. Back at the Continental Congress on June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia put forth a resolution to declare independence. First, though, a committee of 5, including John Adams, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, was established to draft an official Declaration of Independence. The 33-year-old Jefferson, who was the most talented writer and the boldest visionary, was selected to write the Declaration that would come to define the nation. In the sweltering Philadelphia heat, Jefferson labored at his desk at his boarding house and in 3 weeks completed his draft. It contained some of the most important words ever written by an American. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration then explained how the British government under the King had violated those rights, imposing an absolute tyranny over the colonies, and that this gave them a right to separate from Britain and to create a whole new nation with a government that would protect their natural rights. The Committee of Five submitted the draft to the Continental Congress for review and to finally decide if the colonies would declare themselves independent at last. As the war raged on, Congress debated independence. In the midst of a thunderstorm, on July 1st, John Adams delivered an impassioned speech that won over many moderates and ensured the resolution for independence was passed unanimously. And that brings us to our quiz flash from the past. On what day did Congress actually declare independence from Great Britain? July 1st, July 2nd, July 3rd, or July 4th? Sorry to burst many of your bubbles, but it was actually the 2nd of July when they declared independence. That's right, there were bonfires and celebrations across Philadelphia and in New York City when they got word. They tore down the statue of King George. Adams believed July 2nd would forever be the day of national celebration. But 2 days later, after the Congress's final edits to the Declaration, the Continental Congress adopted and passed the document, the Declaration of Independence, on July 4th, 1776. That's what we're celebrating. And the sensitive Jefferson was not happy with the edits that were made to his declaration. In all, they changed about 25% from his draft, many small revisions, but one major deletion. In the grievances section of the Declaration, Jefferson blamed the King for perpetuating the slave trade in the American colonies. But Jefferson's criticism of slavery could have divided the colonies at a time when unity was paramount, so it was removed. However, every man there, including Jefferson himself, who ironically owned hundreds of enslaved people, knew that slavery was entirely opposed to what they were fighting for and the ideals professed in their declaration. Though the Declaration ignored slavery, it did have profound effects. The Americans were no longer colonists or subjects. They were now to be citizens of a republic, not ruled by a king, but by laws. And it also helped the struggling states secure foreign aid that they needed to fight. Britain's enemies in Europe, especially the French, were now ready to support the Americans. And though the war would slug on for several more years, the Declaration helped to ensure the American victory in the end. Because declaring independence is one thing, achieving it is another. The Declaration of Independence is really the birth certificate of the United States. It remains one of the most important documents in United States and world history. It has inspired revolutions and freedom fighters in other lands, and it continues to be an ideal that Americans today still work to live up to. Because remember that history is the light that guides us forward, so thanks for learning some today. This has been History for Humans.